My girlfriend said, "Betrayal, my friends say you hold me back." "We're over." I answered fine. "Then go be with them." How they all looked at her once I left told me all. Have you ever had someone you loved, truly loved, look you dead in the eye and repeat words that weren't even their own? Like they were a puppet, reciting a script written by strangers who hated you? That's exactly what happened to me. The air in that dimly lit bar felt thick with anticipation, like a stage waiting for its final, disastrous act. It was a Tuesday evening, the kind where the streetlights outside hummed, and inside, the hushed whispers of Chloe's 3 podcast friends at the bar were almost audible. They were perched there, pretending not to stare, but their eager eyes tracked every movement, every subtle shift in expression, making it clear this wasn't just a breakup, it was a performance for an audience that had already decided my fate. Chloe looked at me, her gaze unyielding, and declared, "My friends think you limit me, so we're done." I just stared at her for what felt like an eternity, maybe 3 agonizing seconds, before a strange calm washed over me. "Cool," I replied, my voice surprisingly steady. "Then go join them." The silence that fell then was so profound, so thick, you could have cut it with a knife. Her entire friend group, those silent observers, shifted from smug confidence to utter, open-mouthed shock. In that moment, I knew everything. I knew who had really been steering the ship of our relationship for the past 6 months. You see, I'm a cybersecurity analyst. My world is about patterns, identifying threats, solving complex problems with logic, not emotion. And apparently, that's what earned me the label of emotionally unavailable from people who never bothered to know the real me. I'm the guy who's always on time, who remembers anniversaries, who asks about your day and actually listens to the answer. But, it turns out, that's just not enough when you're being measured against some ridiculous podcast host's checklist of what a boyfriend should be. Chloe and I met 2 years ago at a coffee shop. She was engrossed in a book on minimalism, and I was buried in a security audit. We started talking about how people overcomplicate everything when simple solutions often work best. She was a graphic design student, had this wonderfully calm energy about her, and we'd spend hours just walking, talking about everything from architecture to what dogs dream about. It felt incredibly real, authentic, without the need for Instagram validation or performative grand gestures. Our first year was genuinely amazing. We communicated like adults, had our own lives but always made time for each other, and when problems popped up, we talked them through instead of letting them fester. When she moved into my apartment after about 8 months, it was seamless. We split chores naturally, cooked together on weekends, and had this running joke about how boring we must seem because we preferred documentaries over clubbing. Then she got the production assistant job at the Living Your Truth podcast, and everything began to subtly shift. At first, it was just small things, new phrases creeping into her vocabulary, toxic patterns, emotional labor, that doesn't serve me. They were always used in contexts that didn't quite fit our actual situation. I remember the first time she came home and said we needed to talk about boundaries. I asked, "Okay, what's wrong?" And she pulled out her phone, reading from notes she'd taken during a podcast recording about relationship red flags. I listened patiently, then asked her which of those specific red flags she'd actually seen in our relationship. She got quiet, mumbled something about being proactive. Looking back, that should have been a blaring siren, but I just chalked it up to her being excited about her new job. The podcast itself was run by this woman, Samantha, who'd built an empire around helping women identify manipulation and stand up for themselves. Sounds good, right? Until you realize the show's actual formula: take normal relationship friction and rebrand it as abuse. Every episode was the same: anonymous submissions, analyzed through the most uncharitable lens, celebrating women who left their partners for things like, "He wanted to discuss the budget before buying a new car," or "He asked me to text when I got home safe." Their audience ate it up. The comment sections were always overflowing with women praising each other for escaping partners guilty of crimes like being tired after work or having an opinion on dinner plans. Chloe started inviting me to the live recordings downtown, and I went because I wanted to support her, even though the whole vibe deeply unsettled me. The first time I walked in, the entire production team stared at me like I was a specimen under a microscope. During a break, Samantha herself introduced herself, immediately asking what I did. Cybersecurity, I told her. She smiled, that knowing, slightly condescending smile. Oh, so you're analytical. That must be challenging for Chloe. As if being good at my job was a personality defect. I just nodded and said, we make it work. She patted my arm and walked away. Later, Chloe told me Samantha thought I seemed guarded, which apparently was code for emotionally unavailable. That night, walking to the car, Chloe said, they think you're emotionally unavailable. I looked at her, my heart sinking. What do you think? I asked. She hesitated, just long enough for me to know she'd been discussing me with them. Eventually, she said no, not exactly, but she could see where they were coming from, because I didn't always express my feelings in obvious ways. I reminded her I'd spent 4 hours the previous week helping her redesign her portfolio and listening to her stress about a client. But apparently, that didn't count as emotional availability in their framework. The dynamic shifted rapidly after that. Suddenly, every normal interaction we had was filtered through this bizarre lens of red flag or healthy behavior. I'd suggest a quiet Friday night because I had an early security patch to deploy, and she'd accuse me of isolating her from friends. I'd ask if she wanted to talk about why she seemed stressed, and she'd say I was demanding emotional labor. I'd plan a weekend trip to Tahoe because we both loved hiking, and she'd question if I was trying to control our schedule. Nothing I did was just normal anymore. It was all evidence of some deeper pattern, something to be examined and discussed with her friends who had never even had a real conversation with me. The really surreal part was watching her adopt their speaking style. She'd come home and use these perfectly constructed therapy speak sentences that sounded nothing like her. I'm noticing a pattern where you center your own comfort over my needs, she'd say, when I asked if we could turn down the TV for a work call. I'd just stare, wondering where my girlfriend went and who this person was, reading from a script. I tried talking to her about it, multiple times. I'd ask if she felt like she was losing herself in this new job, and she'd immediately get defensive. You're threatened by my growth, she'd snap, as if she'd been an incomplete person before, and only now was becoming her true self by having strangers analyze our relationship to death. The production team started showing up more in our lives too. We'd be at a bar, and suddenly Samantha and 2 other women from the podcast would materialize. Chloe would light up, and I'd become invisible. They'd talk about recent episodes, share stories about their own relationships, and every single story ended with them realizing their boyfriend was manipulative and leaving. They'd congratulate each other, as if escaping was the only acceptable outcome for any relationship that required actual effort. I'd sit there, nursing a beer, watching Chloe laugh at their jokes, nodding along to their theories, feeling her slip away into this strange new world where I'd already been convicted of crimes I didn't commit. One night, about 4 months into her job at the podcast, we were supposed to have dinner, just us, something we hadn't done in weeks, as she was always working late or with the team. I'd made reservations at her favorite Italian place, got home early to change. When she walked in, she immediately announced, Samantha and the team want to grab drinks. Is it cool if we reschedule? I just looked at her. We'd had these plans for 2 weeks, I said. She got this look, like I was asking her to choose between me and her friends. See? This is what they mean. You make me feel guilty for having a social life. I told her that wanting one dinner together after barely seeing each other wasn't making her feel guilty, it was basic relationship maintenance. But she was already texting them she'd be there. I ended up going to the restaurant alone, sat at a table with 2 menus, and ate in silence while the waiter valiantly tried to pretend it wasn't utterly depressing. That was the night I realized I wasn't dating Chloe anymore. I was dating the podcast version of who they thought she should be. And that person had already decided I was the problem. But I still didn't know the worst part. I didn't know that our private conversations, my text messages, even my work schedule, had become content for their group chat. Raw material they were analyzing like I was some kind of case study in manipulation tactics. I didn't know that every word I said to her in private was being screenshotted, dissected by people who'd never spoken to me beyond surface-level small talk at recordings. And I definitely didn't know they were cataloging everything into categories like isolation attempts, guilt-tripping, and financial control. All I knew was that the woman I loved was disappearing, replaced by someone who saw me as a problem to be solved, rather than a partner to build a life with. And I had no idea how much worse it was about to get. The moment I discovered they'd been reading my private messages was so utterly surreal, my brain almost refused to process it. It was like when you see something so wrong that your mind needs a few seconds to catch up to what your eyes are showing you. It was a Tuesday night. Chloe was in the shower. Her iPad was on the coffee table, buzzing with notifications. Normally, I'd never even glance at her devices. Privacy was something I actually believed in, unlike seemingly everyone else in her life. But the notification preview was right there on the lock screen. Samantha, clip 3 is perfect classic isolation phrase. My stomach dropped. I knew exactly what clip 3 was. It was a voice memo I'd sent Chloe 4 days earlier about wanting to book a cabin in Tahoe for our anniversary. My hands trembling, I picked up the iPad. It unlocked. What I saw next made me feel physically sick. I was looking at a group chat called Chloe Support Squad, with 12 members, including the entire podcast production team. Scrolling up, my hands were shaking violently because months of our private conversations were just there. Screenshot after screenshot of texts I'd sent, photos of us together with annotations pointing out my body language, voice memos I'd recorded when I was too tired to type. All of it dissected and analyzed like I was a criminal suspect. There was the text where I'd said I was working late on a security breach and couldn't make dinner, and under it, Samantha had written, "Notice the vague terminology, classic avoidance of real intimacy." There was a message where I'd suggested we save money for a down payment instead of an expensive vacation, labeled financial manipulation, controlling the narrative around their future. There was even a photo from a Saturday morning where I was making breakfast, and apparently, my expression was dismissive because I wasn't smiling enough. Never mind that I'd literally just woken up and hadn't had coffee yet. Every single normal interaction we'd had for months had been fed into this grotesque machine that converted regular relationship moments into fabricated evidence of toxicity. And what made it worse, what truly twisted the knife, was seeing Chloe's responses in the chat. She'd add context, but always in a way that made me look even worse. "He says he's tired," she'd write, "but I think he just doesn't want to engage emotionally." Or, "He planned this whole trip without asking what I wanted," when the reality was I'd literally sent her 3 different cabin options and asked her to pick her favorite. The chat went back 6 months, almost to the exact week she'd started working at the podcast, and I could track the chilling change in her language in real time. She went from defending me, to questioning everything I did, to eventually just accepting their interpretation of my actions without a whisper of pushback. There was this one exchange where I texted her during a work meeting, saying I missed her and wished I was home. Just a sweet, normal message. And someone named Jess had responded in the group chat, love bombing after a period of emotional distance, textbook cycle. And Chloe had replied with a thinking emoji instead of telling them they were insane. I sat there on the couch, reading through months of my life being turned into content for people who seemed to genuinely believe that any man who wasn't performing happiness every second was secretly abusive. And the worst part? I couldn't even be angry, because anger would just prove their twisted point. I heard the shower turn off. I knew I had maybe
built on decisions I made, instead of tests I passed or failed. And some days, that feels like the best revenge of all. Not proving Eleanor wrong, but proving to myself I was always worth more than someone else's manufactured crisis could diminish. I'm still processing this entire whirlwind. If you've ever been put through a test like this, or if you were Eleanor in this situation, what were you thinking? How would you have handled it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious to hear your perspectives. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life narratives.
2 minutes before Chloe came out. My mind raced. I took screenshots of everything, sent them to myself, deleted the sent messages from her iPad, and put it back exactly where it was. My hands were still shaking when she walked into the living room in her bathrobe, asking what I wanted for dinner. I just looked at her, my voice strained, and said we needed to talk about privacy and boundaries. I watched her face instantly contort into that defensive expression before I'd even explained what I meant. She immediately asked if I'd gone through her phone. No, I told her. I saw a notification on your iPad that made me concerned. She snatched it off the table like I'd threatened to smash it. I asked her directly if she'd been sharing our private conversations with the podcast team. She got very still. And that stillness told me everything before she even opened her mouth. They're helping me see patterns I couldn't see on my own, she said, her voice tight. What patterns, exactly? I pushed, my heart hammering. She started listing things in this rehearsed way that sounded nothing like her actual voice. She said I had a habit of making plans without consulting her, that I used work as an excuse to avoid emotional conversations, that I made her feel guilty for spending time with friends. Every single point was something straight out of a podcast episode I'd heard them record. I asked for specific examples, with dates and contexts. She couldn't give me any. She just kept talking in broad generalizations about patterns and red flags and things that felt manipulative, even if she couldn't explain why. I told her, my voice rising slightly, that sharing my text messages and voice memos with a dozen strangers without my consent was an actual violation of privacy. Not just a feeling, but a real thing that actually happened. And she replied, her eyes blank, Samantha says, your wording is manipulative. I just stared at her. In that moment, I realized I wasn't talking to my girlfriend anymore. I was talking to a committee. Every word I said was going to be reported back, analyzed, and used as evidence in a case I didn't even know I was on trial for. She kept going, telling me the group chat was a safe space for her to process her feelings I couldn't understand because I'd never been gaslit the way she had in past relationships. I wanted to scream that I'd been there for every story about her difficult ex, and I had never once shared those private moments with anyone. But there was no point. She'd already decided that my expectation of basic privacy was just another form of control, another red flag, another reason they were right about me all along. I asked her if she understood that everything I told her in confidence, every vulnerable moment, every private thought, was now entertainment for people who didn't know me and had already decided I was the villain. They're not strangers, she said. They're my support system. I told her a support system doesn't require screenshots and forensic analysis of text messages. It requires actual conversation and trust. And she looked at me with an expression that was pure podcast rhetoric and said, you're just upset because you can't control the narrative anymore. The conversation went in circles for another 20 minutes. Her speaking in borrowed phrases, me trying to explain that privacy isn't control. Until finally, I just stopped talking. I realized nothing I said would matter. She'd been marinating in this environment, where every man was suspect and every boundary was oppression, for so long that she couldn't see how completely insane it was to treat your partner like a research subject. I went to bed that night in the spare room because I couldn't stand to be near her. And I lay there in the dark, thinking about how every word I'd said that evening was probably already typed up in that group chat, with commentary about my defensive behavior and inability to take accountability. I thought about all the times I'd comforted her when she was stressed, all the little things I did to make her life easier, all the ways I'd shown up consistently and reliably. And how none of that mattered, because it wasn't performative enough for an audience that needed me to be a villain. The next morning, she was gone before I woke up. Around noon, I got a text, we need to talk. 7 p.m. Madrona Bar. I knew exactly what was coming. You don't schedule a breakup conversation at a public place unless you want witnesses, or you're afraid of the other person's reaction. I texted back sure and spent the rest of the day working from home, finishing a security audit. My professional life was solid. I wanted at least one area of stability, because I knew my personal life was about to implode. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even really hurt. I was just utterly exhausted from months of being treated like a suspect in my own relationship. Honestly, a part of me felt relieved that it was finally going to be over. I showed up at Madrona at 6:55 because being late would obviously be another red flag. Chloe was already there at a corner table with 3 of her podcast friends sitting at the bar, still pretending they weren't watching. That's when I truly understood this wasn't going to be a conversation at all. It was going to be a performance, with an eager audience ready to validate whatever she said. I sat down across from her and immediately noticed she had note cards in front of her. Actual, physical note cards, like she was about to give a presentation. That's when I knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, this was not going to be a real conversation. She started talking before I even ordered a drink, using that same therapy speak voice that had utterly replaced her actual personality. She told me she'd been doing a lot of reflection and realized our relationship had become unhealthy for her growth. I just listened, watching her glance down at her cards every few seconds. When she paused, I asked her to give me one specific example of something unhealthy I'd done. Just one concrete moment, with context. She fumbled through her cards, looking increasingly frustrated. She said things felt wrong, the dynamic was off, and she'd been walking on eggshells. But when I pressed her for when specifically she'd felt that way, she couldn't answer. She just kept circling back to vague feelings and patterns and things Samantha had helped her identify. I could see her friends at the bar leaning in, trying to hear. I realized they'd probably helped write those note cards, probably spent hours crafting this script for her to follow. She eventually just said what she'd probably planned to say from the start. That line about her friends thinking I limited her. And in that moment, this weird, profound calm washed over me, because finally, we were getting to the truth. I asked her if her friends' opinions mattered more than her own experience of our relationship. She said they could see things she couldn't. And that's when I knew. There was no relationship left to save. I told her, cool, then go join them. The look on her face was pure shock, as if she'd expected me to beg, to argue, to give her the dramatic scene they'd probably predicted I'd make. Her friends at the bar had gone completely silent, frozen. I could feel their eyes on me. Chloe just sat there, opening and closing her mouth, trying to figure out what to say now that her carefully crafted script hadn't accounted for me just agreeing. I pulled out my wallet, laid $40 on the table for the drinks neither of us had touched, and told her I hoped she found whatever it was she was looking for. Then I stood up, walked past her stunned friends without even glancing at them, and left the bar. I felt lighter than I had in months, because the performance, finally, was over. The next few days were mechanical, efficient. That's how I handle problems. I make a plan and execute it. I packed up all her stuff from my apartment, every piece of clothing, every book, every random item she'd left scattered over 2 years. I boxed it all neatly and left it in the building lobby with a text telling her when she could pick it up. I blocked her number, blocked her on every social media platform, blocked her friends, blocked anyone associated with that podcast. And I did it all without anger or drama, because I was done giving them content to analyze. She tried calling from different numbers, but I never answered. She sent emails I deleted without reading. 3 days after the bar, she showed up at my apartment building, but I'd already told the front desk not to let her up. Security called me, and I could hear her in the background saying, "I just want to talk." I told them to inform her that all her belongings were already collected, and we had nothing to discuss. A coworker asked me a week later why I seemed so much more relaxed. And I realized it was because I wasn't being monitored anymore. Wasn't second-guessing every word I said or every decision I made. Wasn't living in a relationship that had turned into a surveillance state. I started going to the gym again, reconnected with friends I'd been neglecting, picked up a project car I'd been wanting to work on. I just generally remembered what it felt like to exist without someone documenting my every move for an audience of critics. About 2 months after the breakup, a friend sent me a link to a podcast episode titled "When You're the Red Flag." I knew immediately it was about me, even though they didn't use my name. I listened to the whole thing. It was surreal, hearing Chloe describe our relationship as this oppressive situation where I'd controlled her schedule, isolated her from friends, and made her question her own reality, none of which had actually happened. They painted me as this master manipulator who'd been so subtle about my tactics that even I didn't know I was doing it. The comments section was, predictably, full of people praising Chloe for escaping and calling me every name you can imagine. The thing that truly bothered me wasn't the lies, exactly. It was how many people believed them without question. How ready everyone was to accept that any relationship that ended must have been toxic. And any man who seemed calm must have been hiding something sinister. But here's what they didn't expect. The episode blew up, way bigger than their usual content. And suddenly, people who actually knew me started recognizing the story. My company's HR actually reached out after someone sent them the episode, asking if they were aware their employee was being accused of manipulation on a podcast. I had to explain the whole situation, complete with the screenshots of that group chat I'd saved. Former coworkers, mutual friends, even Chloe's own cousin reached out privately to say they knew the podcast version didn't match reality. And slowly, this counter-narrative started building in the comments section itself, with people pointing out that every example she gave was either completely normal behavior or didn't actually show what she claimed it showed. The podcast's reputation started taking hits, because people went back through old episodes and realized almost every story followed the same pattern of turning regular relationship dynamics into manipulation narratives. Advertisers started quietly pulling out. I didn't participate in any of it. Didn't defend myself publicly or add fuel to the fire. I just let the truth speak for itself while I focused on actually living my life. 6 months after everything imploded, I got an email from Chloe. No subject line, just a message that said, "You weren't toxic. I'm sorry I let them convince me you were." I stared at it for a long time before closing it without responding. Because what was there to say? Sorry doesn't undo months of violation and betrayal. Doesn't erase the fact that she chose strangers' opinions over her own experience. Doesn't change that she was willing to destroy me to fit into a community that required everyone to have a villain origin story. I'm dating someone new now, a software engineer I met through friends, who thinks the whole podcast cult thing is insane, and who actually communicates like a real person instead of reading from a script. We have normal disagreements, where we talk through problems instead of cataloging them as evidence. And when she tells her friends about me, it's because she wants to share her life, not because she needs them to validate her reality. I learned that when someone turns you into a character in their narrative instead of treating you like a real person, the only move is to walk off their stage and let them perform for an empty room. The podcast eventually got cancelled after multiple sponsors dropped them, and Samantha posted some non-apology about learning and growing. I heard through mutual friends that Chloe left the production company and moved to a different city for a fresh start. I don't hate her. I don't spend time thinking about revenge, because honestly, she gave me the greatest gift, which was showing me exactly who not to waste my time on. And now I'm just focused on building a life with someone who sees partnership as collaboration, instead of content creation. What do you think about this whole situation? Have you ever had your private life turned into public fodder? Let me know in the comments below. I'm really curious to hear your perspectives.